The Senate gaveling in this morning. They're expected to resume consideration of a cybersecurity bill that's aimed at protecting the country's electric grid, water systems, financial networks, and transportation systems. Senate leadership is still trying to work out an agreement on the text of the legislation before proceeding to the measure. Live coverage now from the Senate floor here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. Today's guest chaplain, Reverend John Fuller, senior pastor of Prairie Falls Church in Cedar Falls, Iowa, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let's pray. God of all nations and all peoples, we come before you on this day acknowledging you as the sovereign Lord of this nation and of the whole world. Father, it's a privilege to pray for these lawmakers, knowing that you hear and respond to the prayers of your people. Pray for these women and men whom you have put in this position, that they would be filled with your wisdom to make wise choices and decisions as they lead this country. I pray that this body would be courageous. They wouldn't be led by fear or their own personal desires, but they would have the courage to lead with conviction that comes from you. Give these senators strength to lead well through difficult times, that they would be strengthened in their inner being by a power that only comes from you. And Father, I pray for a spirit of humility that recognizes that others are more important than we are, and that you have plans that are greater than ours. That, Father, we would lead with humble and gracious hearts. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 26, 2012. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Michael F. Bennet, a senator from the state of Colorado, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I now move to proceed to calendar number 470, which is S3414, which is the Cybersecurity Act.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 470, S3414, a bill to enhance the security and resiliency of the cyber and communications infrastructure of the United States.
Mr. President, I would now yield to the senior senator from the state of Iowa, Senator Grassley.
No. The senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, it's my privilege to introduce Pastor John Fuller to my fellow senators, and I thank Pastor Fuller for opening the Senate with prayer. It's my privilege to highlight my home pastor and church. Pastor Fuller and his wife Kay are visiting the nation's capital this week. Since 1998, Pastor Fuller has been the senior pastor at Prairie Lakes Church in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Pastor Fuller is a native of Iowa. He was born in Ottawa, grew up in Sloan. His family moved to Sheridan, Wyoming when he was in 8th grade. He graduated from high school at Sheridan. He played both high school and college football. He is, to this day, obviously a diehard Bronco fan. You won't know that, but I sure know it. He is a 1986 graduate of the University of Sioux Falls and a 1990 graduate of Denver Seminary with a master's in divinity degree. He was an associate and preaching pastor at First Baptist Church, Forest City, Iowa, before coming to Cedar Falls, and he came there in 1998 at Prairie Lakes Church and has been senior pastor. I've been worshiping at Prairie Lakes Church for 58 years come this August 29th. The church has changed its name and increased its congregation over the years, but the heart has remained the same and very constant. A small group in 1855 started worshiping in Cedar Falls, Iowa, called the Baptist Society. In 1862, it became the First Baptist Church. The first 45 years that I worshiped at First Baptist Church, the congregation numbered at various times 200 to 300 people. Under Pastor Fuller's leadership, the number of worshipers has grown to about 2,000, with worship centers in Osage, Waterloo, and soon in Grinnell, Iowa, besides the main campus in Cedar Falls, Iowa. In 2005, a new building was constructed, and the name of the congregation then became Prairie Lakes Church. The worship service is very informal. That has changed in the 58 years that I've attended there, but the service has always been Christ-centered, and that has not changed over the years. Prairie Lakes Church is multi-generational with an extraordinary vision for the future. Worship services are heartfelt, creative, practical, Bible-based, and here to serve Christ and here to serve all, those who have just stepped over the faith line as well as those who have been longtime followers of Jesus Christ. Prairie Lakes Church is affiliated with the Baptist General Conference. Prairie Lakes Church is all about loving God, loving people, and influencing the world. Everyone is invited to worship with us, including anybody here in Washington, D.C., by streaming when we stream online at prairielakechurch.org. In closing, I would remind all, according to the Scriptures, that we're all called to be, according to Corinthians, ambassadors for Christ, and that is how I see Pastor Fuller. I'm also grateful to Pastor Fuller for his leadership and faithfulness to the congregation. After 58 years, my looking back, I know that God's Word has been preached faithfully at this congregation. Pastor Fuller has contributed significantly during his tenure and continues to do so. This is what Pastor Fuller had to say about our church. Quote, "There are a lot of good churches around the valley. We're lucky to have that. I think people get attracted here, meaning Prairie Lakes Church, because we just stick with the Bible. We're authentic, we're invitational, and we try to keep things simple." End of quote. These attributes have attracted many congregants, and I believe they'll continue to attract many more, and the church will continue to grow. Lastly, I will pray that God will continue to shine his light through Pastor Fuller, his family, and the Prairie Lakes congregation, and it's my privilege once again to introduce Pastor Fuller to the Senate.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
appreciate my friend's remarks about his pastor. Very, very well thought out. I appreciate it very much. Mr. President, the first hour here today will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders of the designees. The majority will control the first half, the Republicans the final half. I filed cloture last night on the motion to proceed to the cybersecurity bill. I hope we can reach an agreement to have that cloture vote sometime today. If not, we'll have it tomorrow. Mr. President, when a major storm ripped through the Mid-Atlantic region last night, it left millions of people without power. I repeat, millions of people. I can remember I was at my home here in Washington, and it's different than my home in Searchlight, Nevada. In Searchlight, I can hear the wind. Wind blows there a lot, so I hear the wind. It's kind of pleasant for me. But the wind we heard here in our home in Washington was not pleasant. 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, it was loud, and it was abusive, and it was, quite frankly, a little scary. But our power was not affected. But that isn't the same for millions of other people. Residents of Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Ohio, District of Columbia soon realized how quickly a major power outage can alter life as we know it. Senator Manchin of West Virginia, I talked to him a week later. Power is still out, large amounts of power out in West Virginia. He said it's the worst storm that they have ever known in West Virginia. And this power outage altered life as people people knew it here in the entire western part of the United States. The blackout was devastating to many families and many businesses. It was also minor compared to the devastation a malicious cyber terrorist could wreak with a single keystroke. I repeat, as damaging and as frightening as this storm was, we could have a malicious cyber attack by terrorists that would be far, far more devastating than this violent storm. Cyber attackers could all too easily shut down the electric grid for the entire East Coast, the West Coast, the middle part of our country, leaving hundreds of major cities. Any one attack could leave dozens of major cities and tens of millions of Americans without power. We know, Mr. President, as we were shown down in the room here in the Capitol, how an attack would take place and what damage it would do. So we know this is not just make-believe. Without ATMs or debit card readers, commerce would immediately grind to a halt. Without refrigeration, my daughter, who lives here in the D.C. area, that storm hit, their power was out. They waited for a number of hours, and then, Mr. President, they took all the food out of their freezer. They gave away what they could. They threw the rest away, and that's the way it was all over. Their power was out for about a week, and it made it very difficult. They could go down in the basement. They are fortunate enough to have a basement, and the heat wasn't oppressive down there. So without refrigeration, food would rot on the shelves. The freezers would have to be emptied, and people could actually go hungry. Without gas pumps, transportation arteries would clog with abandoned vehicles. Without cell phones or computers, whole regions of the country would be cut off from communication and families would be unable to reach each other. Without air conditioning and without life-saving technology of service of hospitals and nursing homes, the elderly and sick would become much sicker and die. Most hospitals, major hospitals, have backup power, but it's for a limited amount of time. They can only use the storage they can only use this backup power when they're as to how much power fuel they have stored, and that's very limited. The devastation is really unimaginable, but we've heard these ominous scenarios before. What many Americans haven't considered is that the same power grid that supplies cities and towns, stores and gas stations, cell towers and heart monitors also powers every military base in our country. About 99% of electricity used to power military installations come from outside the bases. Nellis Air Force Base, one of the largest in the world of its type, they have some solar energy there they've developed, but the vast, vast majority, over 90% of all their power, in spite of that, comes from outside the base. And more than 85% of that power is provided by the same electric utilities that power homes, businesses, and schools in the civilian world. So a cyber attack that took out the civilian power grid would soon cripple our nation's military, very soon. Although bases would be prepared to weather a short power outage with backup diesel generators, within hours, not days, fuel supplies would run out. Command and control centers would go dark. Radar systems that detect air threats to our country would shut down. Communications between commanders and their troops would go silent. And many weapon systems we left without either the fuel or the electric power to operate. Mr. President, much of what we do militarily is now done by computers, done very, very remotely. It's no secret that the drones that operate for our country all over the world are not operated from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia. They're operated from a base 35 miles outside Las Vegas. That's all done with electricity. So in a few short hours or days, the mightiest military in the world will be left scrambling to maintain basic functions. That's why our top national security officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the director of National Security Agency, Secretary of Defense, CIA director, have said the kind of malicious cyber attacks I've just described is among the most urgent threats to our country. In fact, Mr. President, they have said that unless we do something and do it soon. It's not a question of if, it's only a question of when. There have already been cyber attacks on our nuclear infrastructure, our Defense Department's most advanced weapons, NASDAQ stock exchange, and most major corporations. These are just a few of the things that have already been attacked cyberly. Senator McConnell and I recently received a letter from a bipartisan group of former national security officials, including 6 former Bush and Obama administration officials that presented the danger in stark terms. Quote, "We carry the burden of knowing that 9/11 might have been averted with the intelligence that existed at the time. We don't want to be in the same position again when cyber 9/11 hits. It's not a question of whether this will happen. It's only a question of when." That's what they said, not me. End of quote. The group said the threat of cyber attack represents the most serious challenge to our national security since the onset of the nuclear age 60 years ago. Another quote. The bill before this body, proposed by a coalition of Democrats and Republicans, including Chairman Lieberman and Ranking Member Collins, is an excellent piece of legislation endorsed by many members of the National Security Committee. Mr. President, in my view, it's not strong enough, but it's a tremendous step forward, and I admire the work that they've done. I know some of my colleagues have suggestions how to improve this legislation. I have a few of my own. There's plenty of room for more good ideas. Some of them are already on the table. And it's my intention for senators to have an opportunity to have a robust debate on these proposals. Let's stick with what this bill is all about, and let's have as many amendments as people feel appropriate. The national security experts agree. We can't afford to waste more time. The question is not whether we should act, but whether we will act in time. And Mr. President, as I mentioned at the start of this, we're scheduled to have this vote an hour after we come in tomorrow. I'm working with Senator McConnell now to try to arrange a time, perhaps even today. My goal would be to get on the bill. I hope we can get on the bill. It would be a terrible thing for our country if we're not on the bill. Would be to get on the bill, then have Lieberman, Collins, and Rockefeller, and the other, Feinstein, the other committees who are involved in this, come up with a list of amendments like we've done so well on a number of the bills that we worked through here. And when we come back next week, start doing some legislating. Have some robust debate, get some of these amendments disposed of, and pass this bill on to the House. They've done their bill. We could go to conference and get something done that would be really important for our country.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Mr. President, yesterday our Democratic friends took a vote that says a lot about the way they view the world. After nearly 4 years of spending and debt, millions of Americans are still struggling amidst the slowest recovery in modern times, and the economy is flat on its back. And our friends on the other side think a great way to go forward is to raise taxes. Raise taxes under the guise of pretending to care about the deficit. Democrats are pushing an ideological goal of a symbolic tax increase that won't even fund the government for a week. The vote that we had yesterday, with all but 2 of the Democrats on board, allegedly about doing something about the deficit, wouldn't fund the government for 1 week. Now, they're not even pretending to care about the economy. They've sort of given up on the argument that this is about the economy. We know that because 2 years ago, the Democrats agreed that higher taxes they're now fighting to increase, this tax increase they're now fighting to increase 2 years ago, they agreed it would hurt the economy. So let's look at the economy then and the economy now. At a time when economic growth was 3.5% back in December of 2010, 40 Democrats over here voted to keep rates where they were on the grounds that it was the best thing to do for jobs. December 2010, 40 Democrats voted to keep tax rates where they were because it was the best thing for jobs. Yet now, when the growth rate is 2%, 3.5% then, 2% now, and 13
13 million Americans are still out of work. They're voting to slam nearly 1 million businesses with a tax increase. Now, maybe they're expecting the GDP numbers tomorrow to be 3.5%. We'll see. That's one of two things. Either our Democratic friends don't even care about the economy and jobs anymore, either they're just embracing Thelma and Louise economics, let's just take everybody off the cliff, and hoping people support them for some other reason. Or their economic worldview is so far outside the mainstream of everyone else who has looked at this situation that they think 2% growth and 13 million Americans unemployed is good enough. Maybe they think that's just as good as we can do. That's where this ideological crusade of theirs is taking them, right in that direction. Well, I just hope for the sake of a struggling American economy that some of them soon see how misguided an approach this is. Let me repeat, 2 years ago, in December of 2010, when the economy was growing at a rate of 3.5%, 40 of our Democratic colleagues and the President and the Vice President and I and the Speaker agreed to extend the current tax rates for 2 years because it would be good for jobs. And just yesterday, with 2 exceptions, every Democrat voted to raise taxes on 1 million businesses when the growth rate, the GDP increase rate, the growth rate right now is 2.5%, and 13 million Americans are looking for work. Now, that's not a prescription for the economy. That's an ideological crusade. That's not about America's jobs. That's about the election 4 months from now. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the following hour will be equally divided and controlled between the 2 leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half and the Republicans controlling the final half.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I rise to speak on the floor of the Senate again this morning to urge my colleagues to vote to extend the production tax credit for wind energy. It's also known as the production tax credit. I know the presiding officer's home state of West Virginia has a robust wind energy sector as well. I look forward to coming to the floor and talking about your state in the future. The reason I'm talking about the production tax credit is it's set to expire at the end of this year, and it will cost citizens in my state and the rest of their nation their jobs. We cannot let this happen. Tens of thousands of vital jobs are dependent on the wind industry all across our great country. And as I've mentioned, Mr. President, I come to the floor on a daily basis, and I highlight a state and talk about what the production tax credit has done to encourage economic growth in that state. And today I want to talk about the great state of Illinois, the land of Lincoln, where the wind industry is thriving. Illinois is an expressive example of how wind resources can be harnessed and put to good use, creating jobs and supporting local communities. Mr. President, overall, Illinois has the 4th largest installed wind capacity in the United States, with over 600,000 homes powered by the wind. If fully utilized, Illinois' wind energy resource could provide over 525% of the state's current electricity needs. That's truly a staggering amount of electricity for the 5th largest state in the nation. In 2011, Illinois was second only to California in the number of new wind energy projects completed, and they installed more wind turbines there than in any other state in the country. Clearly, Illinois recognizes the economic potential that wind energy holds for the future, just as many states have. Just last week in Illinois, Invenergy announced that it has completed construction of the Bishop Hill Wind Energy Facility in Henry County. That is up in the northwestern part of Illinois near Davenport, Iowa. And the project covers 22,000 acres of farmland, includes over 100 wind turbines, and can power 60,000 homes. This project, the Bishop Hill project, is clearly a huge investment in Illinois and our nation's clean energy future. But the economic power of wind energy has been equally impressive. The wind energy there supports 7,000 jobs. It contributes close to $19 million every year in property taxes to local communities. And Illinois led our nation in 2011 with over 400 new wind turbines installed. Mr. President, just this month, Illinois State University released a report that estimates that Illinois' 23 largest wind farms will contribute roughly $5.8 billion to the local economies over the lifetime of these projects. The construction of these wind farms generated over 19,000 jobs that cut paychecks totaling over $1 billion for workers. These are good-paying, high-skilled jobs that we're proud to have in our country and that the Americans that hold them are proud to have. And it's just one part of the overall wind industry story. For example, the Odell Grade School in Odell, Illinois, has a much-needed renovation project underway that will expand both the school and make it more energy efficient. Now, while this project is expensive, it will be paid for in part by payments from local wind farms. Wind energy is supporting a better education for Odell's youth without increasing taxes to the local residents. This is not unique to Illinois. It's happening all across our country. And I have no doubt that the people of Odell would agree with me that extending the PTC is a common-sense proposal. However, without Congress extending the production tax credit, our country and the wind industry face literally impending disaster. In fact, many wind energy manufacturers and producers have already been preparing for the end of the PTC by backing off their investments in many of these communities like Odell and by announcing future layoffs of thousands of workers. It's just flat out unacceptable that we in the Congress would let this happen. Mr. President, I think you get where I'm heading. This is a serious issue that needs attention now, not next month, not in the fall, not in the lame duck session, but now. The wind industry will not wait for us to extend the PTC at some date in the future. They've already begun to scale back their operations and move overseas. Further inaction is unacceptable. China is stepping into the breach and literally taking our jobs overseas. Other countries are prepared to do the same thing. So for us in the Congress to miss this opportunity to not only preserve jobs but put in place a policy that would create thousands of good-paying jobs because of election year gridlock is just, again to say this, flat out unacceptable. If we don't act, our people in our states will suffer. So I come to the floor every day to implore my colleagues to extend the wind production tax credit as soon as possible. The PTC, it equals jobs. We ought to pass it as soon as possible. Mr. President, I'll be back next week to continue discussing the wind production tax credit and urge us to be bold, take up this issue, and extend the wind production tax credit. It's about American jobs. It's about maintaining our leading position in the world when it comes to clean energy development. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Acosta. If the Senator could sustain from the quorum call, please.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today in order to continue the efforts started right here earlier this week, efforts by the women of the Senate and the men who support the Violence Against Women Act to bring a simple, straightforward message to our friends in the House of Representatives. Stop the games and pass the inclusive, bipartisan Senate VAWA bill without delay. The Violence Against Women Act is a bill that has successfully helped provide life-saving assistance to hundreds of thousands of women and families. It's a bill that passed the Senate 3 months ago today by a vote of 68 to 31. It's a bill that has consistently included bipartisan provisions to address those that are not being protected by it each and every time it has been reauthorized. But here we are, back on the Senate floor, urging support for a bill that should not be controversial. And just as we did on Tuesday, just as we're doing today, and just as we're going to continue to do in the coming weeks, we will be making sure this message resonates loud and clear, both here in Washington, D.C. and back in our home states, because we are not going to back down. Not while there are thousands of women across our country who are excluded from the current law. In fact, for Native and immigrant women and LGBT individuals, every moment that our inclusive legislation to reauthorize Violence Against Women Act is delayed is another moment they are left without the resources and protection they deserve in this country. Mr. President, the numbers are staggering. 1 in 3 Native Americans, women, will be raped in their lifetimes. 1 in 3. 2 in 5 of them are victims of domestic violence, and they are killed at 10 times the rate of the national average. And these shocking statistics are not isolated to one group of women. 25 to 35% of women in the LGBT community experience domestic violence in their relationships, and 3 in 4 abused immigrant women never entered the process to obtain legal status, even though they were eligible, because their abuser husbands never filed their paperwork. This should make it perfectly clear to our colleagues in the other chamber that their current inaction has a real impact on the lives of women across America affected by violence. Women like Deborah Parker. Deborah is the vice chairwoman of the Tulalip tribe in my home state of Washington. Mr. President, Deborah was repeatedly abused, starting at a very young age, by a non-tribal man who lived on a reservation. Not until after the abuse stopped, sometime around when she was in the 4th grade, did Deborah realize that she was not the only child suffering at the hands of that same assailant. At least a dozen other young girls had fallen victim to that man, a man who was never arrested for his crimes, never brought to justice, and still walks free today. All because he committed these heinous acts on the reservation. And as someone who is not a member of a tribe, it's an unfortunate reality that he is unlikely to ever be held liable for his crimes. Mr. President, reauthorizing an inclusive VAWA is a matter of fairness. Deborah's experience and the experience of other victims of that man do not represent an isolated incident. For the narrow set of domestic violence crimes laid out in VAWA, tribal governments should be able to hold accountable defendants that have a strong tie to the tribal community. Mr. President, I was very glad to see Republican Congresswoman Judy Biggert and several of her Republican colleagues echo those sentiments last week. They sent a letter to Speaker Boehner and Leader Cantor. The Republican members explicitly called on their party leadership to end this gridlock, and I quote, Senate-endorsed provisions and accept the Senate-endorsed provisions that would protect all victims of domestic violence, including college students, LGBT individuals, Native Americans, and immigrants, end quote. So today, I'm here to urge Speaker Boehner to listen to the members of his own caucus and join us in making a major step to uphold our government's promise to protect its people. People like Maribel and Maria, 2 more young women who come from my home state of Washington. As a transgender woman, Maribel has been subjected to random acts of violence by family and boyfriends and strangers. She has been mugged and attacked on the street. She has suffered broken bones and cuts and bruises. She's been raped, and she was left for dead. What Maribel said to me was deeply concerning. She said, "Not once have the police ever conducted an investigation, much less shown any concern for me. Rather, my experience with law enforcement is one of harassment and abuse. I've been ostracized by family and friends, and in fact, it is one of my first memories," unquote. She experiences hate daily from those that think she has no place in our society. And then there's Maria. Shortly after her wedding, Maria's husband became a different man, she said. His abuse ranged from emotional to physical, and on 2 separate occasions, he held a knife to Maria's throat, threatening to kill her. He constantly threatened Maria with deportation back to Jamaica, and eventually he refused to attend the interview with immigration authorities necessary for her to obtain a green card. So her application was denied for lack of attendance. She was angry and scared, but she found the courage to ask her husband for a divorce. In response, he raped her. Maria moved out of the house, and though her husband repeatedly tracked her down and assaulted her, to save her own life, Maria fled to Seattle with her 2 young children. Mr. President, it does not have to be this way. You know, I was so proud to have been serving in the Senate in 1994 when we first passed the Violence Against Women Act. Since we took that historic step, VAWA has been a great success in coordinating victims' advocates and social service providers, law enforcement professionals, to meet the immediate challenges of combating domestic violence. And along with its bipartisan support, it has received praise from law enforcement officers and prosecutors, judges, victim service providers, faith leaders, healthcare professionals, advocates, and survivors. Violence Against Women Act has broad support for one reason: it works. Where a person lives, their immigration status, who they love, should not determine whether or not perpetrators of domestic violence are brought to justice. These women cannot afford any further delay, not on this bill.
Would the senator yield for a question?
I would be happy to yield to this.
I think the senator from Washington has made an extraordinary presentation in terms of outlining the facts with respect to the abuse that women face. And having done a series of forums around my home state, and as you know, in our part of the country, in Washington and Oregon, you know, many, many small communities, 10, 15,000 people. It's my experience, and I'd be interested in getting my colleague's assessment since she's been our leader on this, is without the Violence Against Women Act, it's my understanding that women in rural areas who face the kind of brutal treatment you've described would literally have nowhere to turn. That the Violence Against Women Act for women in rural areas in particular is sort of the last line of defense between them and the abusers. Is that my colleague?
I would say the senator from Oregon is absolutely correct. If you have been beaten and abused and you feel as a victim of violence, you have nowhere to turn, especially in a rural community where everyone knows everyone and you don't know who to turn to. There is no place to go. The Violence Against Women Act provides you with the support of law enforcement officers and advocates so that you can get out of a very abusive situation.
Well, I'm going to listen to the rest of my colleagues' remarks, and I'll have my own. But I just want to thank her for her leadership. I think this is such an important issue. This isn't about dollars and cents, and it's not about politics. It's about doing what's right in preventing violence, and I commend my colleague for her statement.
Well, I thank the senator from Oregon, and I would just say I know he's going to speak in just a few minutes, but I know that he spent a great deal of time going around his state and listening to some of these women who had been victims of domestic violence and knows personally from their stories how important it is that we cannot continue to delay this over some called blue slip. It's not about a blue slip. It's about doing the right thing. We have overcome the blue slip issue issue time and time again for issues like FAA and transportation bills and many other pieces of legislation, because it's the will of the body to do so. So to tell a woman in rural Oregon or Washington State that this bill can't happen because of a blue slip, ridiculous. They've been told that they can't get help for a lot tougher reasons. Let's not let a blue slip be the thing that comes between them and the support they need. In fact, I would say to Senator Organ and all of our colleagues, on Tuesday, the New York Times ran an editorial on just this that really gets to the heart of it. They said, and I quote, "House Republicans have to decide what is more important, protecting victims of domestic violence or advancing the harsh anti-gay and anti-immigrant sentiments of some on their party's right. At the moment, harshness is winning." But the editorial also echoed our sentiments that it does not have to be this way. It pointed out that, quote, "On May 15th, Senate Republicans joined with the Chamber's Democratic majority to approve a strong reauthorization bill." And it ends with what we all know will take to move this legislation forward: leadership from Congressman Boehner. And so, Mr. President, today we are here on the Senate floor to make this effort and to call on for the same thing: leadership. It's time for Speaker Boehner to look past ideology and partisan politics. It's time for him to hear the stories of women across America who have not had the protection of this bill, and to make a major step forward that will assure that a woman, no matter where she lives or who she is, will have the protections that this great country can offer. So thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I thank my colleague from Oregon for his real passion on this issue and understanding, and for taking the time to hear from women and men who've been impacted. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Oregon.
President, I want to follow up on the very important remarks made by our colleague, Senator Murray, because I really, as a result of the debate that we've had in Washington, D.C., knew that there was a significant, problem. But until we held these forums across our state, and we essentially went into every corner of Oregon, it really didn't come home to me how serious a problem this is. And for a minute or two, I want to highlight this point I got into with Senator Murray with respect, to rural areas. Some of the stories, for example, that I was told, for example, about a woman in Central Oregon who essentially, faced with an abuse, a very abusive relationship, spent the evening trying to hide out in ditches in the community. And she would just run from ditch to ditch, and of course, you get pretty banged up and bruised when you do something like that, but she hid out in ditches through the night in order to avoid her abuser. But then it comes to morning time, and she wants to get out. She wants to get to the safety net programs, a wonderful shelter in her area. But the fact was, the only way to get out was to ask for a ride from the one person who had a vehicle in the community, and that was the person who abused her in the first place. So literally, in a rural community, and I heard this account just recently, she had nowhere to turn. And that's why I characterize the Violence Against Women program as really, especially for rural women, the last line of defense between them and the abuser. And finally, in one community, I know my colleague will identify with this because I enjoyed going to West Virginia and the like, in a rural community in the eastern part of our state, it was described to me that there was no transportation out of the community, no transportation at all. And the woman involved was going to literally have to stay there and face continual abuse. And finally, the one vehicle in the community was a fishing shuttle. I'm sure the senator from West Virginia identifies with that, because it's something we have in our rural communities, a vehicle that takes folks fishing. And the fishing shuttle said, the owner of it, he said, I'm going to be the one to take this woman to safety. I don't need to be reimbursed. I don't need to have some kind of government program or something. I'm going to do it because it's right. And that's how that woman in a rural community escaped her abuser. She got out. She got free. She was able to shake out of the clutches of the abuser because the fellow who owned the fishing shuttle stuck up for her. But, Mr. President, I think this is Senator Murray's, point. I don't think we can accept that all across the country that we're going to have fishing shuttles, available in order to rescue women who are subject to this kind of abuse. I think that's, pretty far-fetched, and the good hearts of, Oregonians came through in that particular situation. But we've got to reenact this program. And the fact is, Mr. President and colleagues, this has been the law of the land for more than a decade. There has not been a shred of partisanship, in it. It's not about ideology. It's about protecting women, from brutality. And I had thought, frankly, Mr. President, that we had gotten over some of the arguments against this legislation that had been trotted out in the past. For example, it was often said in the past, well, maybe these abuse cases really aren't abuse. Maybe they're just kind of family matters. They're going to get settled when family kind of calms down and maybe somebody got upset about something, and then in a day or so everything is going to go back to normal. That's not the case, Mr. President. This is about repeated instances of violence. Repeated instances of violence you can't just slough off as a family member, as a family difference of opinion. It's crime. It's brutal violence. And that's why we need this legislation, and we need it, reauthorized. I think it's also especially important, Mr. President, given some of the budget cuts that we have seen that are particularly hitting small communities like a wrecking ball. For example, in Josephine County, a rural part of our state, they're in the position, Mr. President, where when a subpoena goes out, they essentially don't have the resources to follow it up. In other words, the subpoena is used to, in effect, set in motion the law enforcement, process, bring the abuser, to justice. And I was told by the key law enforcement officials in Josephine County in a community forum that I held in Medford, Oregon, for folks from the southwestern part of the state, that they really, literally didn't have the resources to follow up on how to ensure that that abuser was brought to justice. Now, Mr. President, I'd make just a couple of additional points. I see colleagues on the floor waiting to speak. But I also want to talk about the costs that are associated with this. You have two kinds of costs. First, you have direct health care costs that stem from the violence that you see perpetrated against women. And then also you have costs in terms of lost productivity. At a time when we are getting hit very hard by unemployment, and we know we're in a productivity race with Asia and India and China and other countries, we can't afford the costs, the health care costs of violence against women that ends up having women land in hospital emergency rooms and the like, nor can we allow this lost productivity at a time when we are pushing so hard to create more good paying jobs. And the protection that's offered through the Violence Against Women Act saves my home state of Oregon now millions of dollars through its key provisions. Safety from domestic violence would save Oregon more than $35 million per year in direct health care costs. Our state loses approximately $9.3 million per year in lost productivity from paid work as a result of domestic violence. And the fact is the preventive services offered by the Violence Against Women Act saves money, as does the very important work that's done by victim services. A study of 278 victims in my hometown of Portland who received domestic violence and housing assistance found that those services resulted in more than $610,000 in savings during the first 6 months. So there's savings in terms of assistance, whether it's housing or counseling. Emergency medical care utilization is reduced as a result of emergency services, safety net services being available. And whether it's one measure or another, Mr. President, from a financial standpoint, reauthorizing the Violence Against Women legislation makes sense. But at the end of the day, while the financial savings are substantial, Mr. President, it seems to me the Violence Against Women Act is about restoring dignity to women who've been abused in our country. No woman in the United States should be subject to the kind of physical abuse that I've documented in cases coming from Oregon that Senator Murray has described this afternoon. They strip our people, women in this country, of their dignity and their confidence and their ability, after they shake free from their abuser, to get on and have the kind of productive life that they want for themselves and their family. So, Mr. President, ultimately, this is about dignity. It's about doing what's right. This legislation has been on the books for more than a decade. There is no reason, none whatever, Mr. President, that this legislation isn't passed overwhelmingly on a bipartisan, bicameral basis. And I'm going to do everything I can, Mr. President, here on the floor of the Senate, talking with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make sure that this legislation is reauthorized, because what I saw during these community forums in my home state from small towns across Oregon shouldn't happen in my state. It shouldn't happen anywhere, because it is not right, and the Senate can take action to stop it. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arkansas.
There's been a lot of talk about the dangers of raising taxes during a recession. President Obama famously said in 2009, and I quote, "You don't raise taxes in a recession." Our economy is certainly worse now than it was then, but that did not stop the Senate majority from pushing through a tax increase on our small business owners yesterday. We need to get our fiscal house in order, and that starts with budgeting in a responsible manner. Washington's primary problem is not a revenue problem. Washington's primary problem is a spending problem. And the Senate majority's actions have exasperated that problem. The Senate has failed to pass a budget for the past 3 years. Meanwhile, our country is facing record deficits and an ever-increasing debt. This is the 5th straight year that Washington's excessive spending has led to a $1 trillion deficit. It now sits at a jaw-dropping $15.9 trillion. And the Senate majority's only answer to this crisis is to raise taxes on our job creators during a time while our country has an unemployment rate of over 8%. Along with failing to produce a budget, the Senate majority leader is now backtracking on a pledge to enact every individual appropriations bill this year. Needless to say, I'm disappointed. In fact, I think it's safe to say that our entire caucus is disappointed. It wasn't too long ago that I was down here on the floor praising the majority leader in his efforts and those that would have us go forward and enact our individual appropriations bills. We believe that we had a good faith agreement to move these bills to make the effort to function the way this body was established to work, to do our job and pass all of the appropriations bills so that the government operates on a budget the way that every Arkansan does. Now the majority is telling us this isn't going to happen. Determining how we spend hard-earned taxpayer dollars is a basic responsibility of Congress. We know tough choices have to be made in these appropriations bills, but moving forward is the right direction. The trend of continuing resolutions and giant omnibus appropriations bills has got to stop. Enacting all appropriations bills in regular order would be an important step to reducing government spending. It would help balance our budget while investing in programs Americans have come to rely on. Moving forward on these bills would return the Senate to its proper function and provide a framework of spending so the American people can see and understand where their hard-earned money is going. Most importantly, would help us back away from the fiscal cliff we are hanging on to. Here's the reality. We borrow around 40 cents of every dollar we spend. We are running record-breaking deficits every year. The average American family doesn't have the luxury to live by this sort of budgeting. If you tried to run our household or your household, your business, the bank would cut you off. It's time we apply that lesson to Washington. We are at a crossroads in our country. If we continue down the path we are going, we risk going in the direction of Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and now Spain, each facing economic crises that have pushed them to the brink of default. If Congress continues the reckless spending rather than creating an immediate solution to this crisis, our actions will inevitably lead to an economic collapse. We can't keep kicking the can down the road, which is exactly what we are doing by passing continuing resolutions and omnibuses after continuing resolutions and omnibus, and it goes on and on. Each one of us in this chamber owes it to the American people to work together to help our country today and build a path of success for the future. Our founding fathers laid the foundation that allows the Senate to function effectively and efficiently, but it does require us working together. The American people are tired of the finger-pointing that has stalled much of the work that they've sent us here to do. That starts with trying to enact all of the appropriations bills through a regular process each year. I sincerely hope the Senate Majority Leader reconsiders the decision to cancel consideration of the appropriations bills, again, so that we can get back to a normal budgeting process, get back to a normal method, an efficient method, a very transparent method, so that the American people can see where their taxpayer dollars are going. And with that, I yield back, or note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.